Today's shir is entitled How to Overcome Spiritual Distancing. And I'd like to focus on some of the images that we are familiar with from over the years involving the Hagadol of Pesach, and particularly to see it perhaps a little bit against the backdrop of the moment that we're up to. As I move through the shir, hopefully that will become more apparent. So if you can just pay attention on the screen, I'll be putting up the sources, and you're welcome to follow along. Okay, this is actually an image, by the way. I'm always into the cover image. It's an image of a place that you can go to visit today in the land of Israel. It is just south of Jerusalem. It is near an area that I was privileged to live in for a year, and that some of our members live in that area today. Our own Rabbi and Mrs. Well live in the vicinity of this picture in Gush Etzion, just south of Yerushalayim. What you're seeing in the picture here is actually a road. The road is called in Hebrew Derech HaAvot. This is the path of our patriarchs. It was a road in the temple period and even in the biblical period. As far as we know, it was this road that Avram Avinu and Sarah Imenu walked on. In the foreground of it, you will notice what looks like a short obelisk. It is a milestone, quite literally a Roman milestone from the Second Temple period. Those were placed, of course, at regular Roman miles on Roman roads. So I'd like to focus a little bit on this moment, the Romans placing their own structures in the vicinity of, and in not just the vicinity, but inside Eretz Yisrael, and some of the reaction, the spiritual distancing that transpired as a result of that. Our Seder is really against the backdrop of walks like this one. We think that this walk, the Gemara tells us about a Masechet Makot on Daf Chav Daled Amud Aleph, transpired actually in circa, we're not 100% sure, but we think around the year 95 of the Common Era, because we know that various sages of the Mishnah traveled to Rome in order to appeal to the Roman authorities. And we know who was on that trip. And here's a description of them walking. Who is that? It's Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azar, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Akiva. They're walking on the road. They are somewhere on a road, and no doubt a Roman road, and they can hear a great sound of Rome that they can hear from this area, which could be translated, Cincino translated as Potoli. Today it's Pozzoli. I hope I'm not mispronouncing it. It's the main port of near Rome. And they can hear the sound of the triumphant masses, and they all start to cry. And Rabbi Akiva starts to laugh. Everybody knows the second part of this Gemara. Many fewer people know the first part of this Gemara. And I'm quoting, of course, for a reason. Rabbi Akiva is laughing. They're on the road, and Rabbi Akiva is laughing while they cry. How could you be laughing? How could you be crying? You can read the Gemara for yourself. They say these people are idolaters, and look how they are living a life of plenty. They are actually offering their offerings to their idolatry. Everything is right with them. And what if we have? The footstool of our God is burned. We don't have anymore the house in Yerushalayim. It's been burned in a fire. Should we not cry? So he said, that's why I'm laughing. If that's what's going to happen to those who go against God's will, all the more so the reward that will happen for those of us who follow God's will. That's the first part of the story that very few people know or quote. Everybody skips to the second story, which is another story. And I quote both of these stories, not only because of the road imagery and the traveling, but because the second story is against the backdrop of the first one. Presumably, it comes after the first story, because we don't need to hear who the people are a second time. Now we hear the same group. Shuv Pam Achat Hayu Only Yerushalayim. It's the same group. The same group you saw up here, Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azar, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Akiva, they're walking on the way. Now the same people go up to Yerushalayim. And when they get to Harat Sofim, what we call today Mount Scopus, Harat Sofim, they tore their clothing. That, by the way, is a halacha psuka ad hayom hazeh. Kevin she'igiu lahar habayit, when they got to the Temple Mount, they saw some kind of a fox that was coming out of the Holy of Holies. They all started to cry. Rabbi Akiva was laughing. Many people know this Gemara continues, and that's the ongoing piece of Gemara here. This is the snapshot I want to leave for you of these are the sages, 4 sages, who, wouldn't you know, are walking in Rome and then walking Yerushalayim, and now we will meet them soon again because they're all at our Pesach Seder. Let me explain to you the family tree of who comes to the Pesach Seder. I found this chart online. I thank whoever made it. It seemed to be some kind of open source image, so I didn't have too many compunctions about putting it here. I highlighted for you the people who are going to make a cameo in the Haggadah Shel Pesach. First of all, Hillel, known as Hillel Hazaken. It's a little bit beyond the purview of what we have time for in this slot to be able to parse his role. He has a crucial role, and actually important and crucial role, particularly this year when Erev Pesach coincides with Shabbat. I don't have time to go down that road, pardon the pun, so we'll leave it at that. But Hillel Hazaken is the prince. He is the first of a line of an actual dynasty of princes who would be at the helm of the Sanhedrin Hagadol, the High Court of Jerusalem, or the High Court, I shouldn't say in Jerusalem, Sanhedrin Hagadol of 71 judges. He's the Nasi. And you can see if you look down the line, there's actually a lineage. His son, Rabbi Shimon, takes over. Then comes someone called Rabbi Gamliel Hazaken, Rabbi Gamliel the elder. Then Rabbi Shimon, his son. Of course, it was already a tradition to repeat the names of people for a name for those who had come before. Then comes Rabban Gamliel. He is also known as Rabban Gamliel of Yavne. And many of us know that story. We'll come to it in a few minutes. But all across the page is also who was in the same generation as who else. The very famous Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai that we know so much about and to whom we are so indebted for his famed words, give me Yavne and her sages, is actually also the teacher of the next generation of sages who happen to be of the same line and at the same time period as Rabban Gamliel of Yavne. They are Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hanania. These 2 individuals are the 2 people who are the Rebbeim, the teachers of Rabbi Akiva. 2 other sages from this time period, Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Tarfon. And we know these sages in this area here, all of these sages, because they'll be sitting together, the 5 of them, at a Seder where? In Bnei Brak. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. But I wanted to show you what the lineage is and the relationships between these people might be. By the by, Rabban Gamliel's grandson, Rabban Gamliel of Yavne's grandson, is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rabbi Yehuda the prince, who is the redactor of the Mishnah. And of course, the family tree that just keeps going, it's a tree of teachers to students. You can see all the lines coming to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. After him is the Amoraic period. But here we find that in this era, this is the era of our Seder. The people who made the Haggadah decided they wanted to focus us, laser focus us on a particular time period, not the biblical time period. That would have been very obvious as a choice. It tells the story from the book of Shemot. But instead, we are going to the Seder of these people. Someone just wrote in, I thank you very much. Apparently can be found in a book called Aiding Talmud Study by Rabbi Aryeh Carmel. Thank you for pointing that out. I was not aware of that. I didn't know its source. I found it just online. You poke around, you find all sorts of things. So I give credit where credit is due. So all of these people are, for some reason, really crucial to show up at my Seder, your Seder, and actually all of the Seders for generations. They've shown up. Now, this Rabban Gamliel, who's Rabban Gamliel of Yavne, we actually hear his name first spoken chronologically, not when he is in Yavne, but when he's still a little child. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, very famously, can't go into all the details now, but he has a moment where basically as the titular political head of the Jewish people, a student himself of Hillel Hazaken, he stands before Vespasian, who is not yet the emperor. And he makes a request, which turns out to be 3 requests. He tells him, ask me what you would like. Vespasian asks him, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says he wants 3 things. What did he say? He basically, Vespasian said, Amar le mezil azilna, the inash achrina, and mishadarna, someone else will be coming to take my stead. Vespasian was actually being called to become the emperor of Rome. Elaboy minoi midei de'aten lach, tell me what you want, I will give it to you. Amar le tin liyavne v'chachma, everyone knows that, but people forget the other 2 things that were requested by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. V'shishilta de Rabban Gamliel, I want to keep the lineage of Rabban Gamliel. Va'asvata the Messiah and Leila Rabbi Tzadok. I want the doctors to heal Rabbi Tzadok. Who is and where is Rabbi Tzadok? I can't go into all the details now, but he's on this chart right up here. That's Rabbi Tzadok. He's in the same generation as all of these people. Okay. Now, at this time, it seems that Rabban Gamliel himself is actually quite young. If you look at just the timeline in Rabbi Carmel, give credit now where credit is due, bring redemption to the world, is around at the same time approximately as these sages. He seems to be, according to some accounts, a child that Rabban Yochanan Zaki is asking. The reason why he's asking for the chain of Rabban Gamliel is the chain started by Rabban Gamliel Hazaken. And the reason why that's the name people would, and Romans would recognize, is because Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, unfortunately, was killed just before the Churban of the second Beit HaMikdash. What his role was or was not in the insurrection, that's anybody's guess. But Rabban Gamliel Hazaken, this was the house of Rabban Gamliel Hazaken, and so his namesake, Rabban Gamliel Diab, saved him. And in fact, these requests are acceded to by Vespasian. Now, there must have been great fear going on here because at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, there was no longer a playbook. What do we do now? The mainstay of the reason why we have Pesach it's called Pesach because of the Korban Pesach, the beginning of Sefer Shmot's description of the redemption starts with Rosh Chodesh, that's one, and two, in chapter 12 of Sefer Shmot, it's about the centrality of this Korban. This offering is the central mainstay of religious observance as far as the year. And if that were to disappear, what's the net result going to be? Recall, of course, that in the days when there was a Korban Pesach, a person who did not offer the Korban Pesach by dint of laziness or for some other wanton reason was essentially excised from the Jewish people. It's the Isser Karet. It's so crucial that already in the Midbar, in the desert, is the first time that the Jewish people express a grave fear. Those people who realize we're not going to be able to make this offering happen, they're concerned what happens to us. So in the 9th chapter of the book of Bamidbar, which is in the second year, it's 1 year after this, it's the second year that they've left Egypt in the first month, God tells Moshe, tell the Jewish people they have to do the Korban Pesach. Here's what they're going to do. And right away, what do we hear? We find these people who are actually ritually impure, who are not able to do the Pesach. They're very nervous. And they come to Moshe, why should we be denigrated? Why should we be diminished by the fact that we don't have this? And Moshe says, wait a sec, let me ask Hashem what should happen now. And we know what happens next. The whole notion of what's called Pesach Sheni comes about. But I want to share with you something you may have never thought of before, which is to say, what happened after the destruction, right after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash? We assume that there was no more temple. That's what it means, obviously. We have a day on the calendar that we speak about it, obviously. It's Tisha B'Av. But look at this very strange Gemara that is about a letter written while sitting on a step on the Har HaBayit. Are these the exact steps in this picture? I don't know. But there's a step somewhere on the Temple Mount itself where we find the following is taking place. It's a story about Rabban Gamliel, who was sitting on a step on the Har HaBayit, and there's a sofer, a scribe standing before him named Yochanan, and he tells him, take a letter. In fact, 3 letters. He writes a letter to the Jewish people who live in the Galil. He writes a letter to the people who live south in the territory of Yehuda, and then in the Negev. Then he sends a letter, of all things, the 3rd letter, to the brethren who are in Bavel. And this letter, among other things, and you could read it with the people who are in Bavel, our brethren, la'achana b'nei galvata b'Bavel, la'achana b'madai, u'lishar kol galvata Yisrael, anyone who's in exile anywhere, shlomichon yazgei la'alam, may you keep your peace for all time. Sei gesund. Now, here's what I want to tell you. I want you to know that at this moment, the way that the year is shaping up, the time that we're in, it's springtime, it's too early to make Pesach happen. And therefore, in my capacity as the Nasi, as the prince, basically, of the high court, no longer in Yerushalayim, now in Yavne, I'm going to intercalate the year. I'm going to add an extra month of Adar so that the season will match up, so that everything will happen a little bit later in the solar calendar. Because right now, we have among the issues, the lambs are still too young. What are the lambs too young for? They seem to be too young to be given as offerings. They're all descriptions of different aspects having to do with offerings. So not all, but most of the things described here, about the crop, about the lambs that are described here. Why would that be described? Why after the Churban? Again, this is the Rabban Gamliel, says the Gemara, says Rashi here, based on how this Gemara is set up. This is not Rabban Gamliel Hazaken, the grandfather. This is Rabban Gamliel, the grandson, Rabban Gamliel of Yavne, who is actually in Yavne with the high court, the exiled high court of the Jewish people, sending letters, but he's not in Yavne. He's sitting on a step at the Har Habayit. How could that be? That's been destroyed. Well, the temple was destroyed, but the Temple Mount was not destroyed. And he's sitting there and he's writing a letter to whom? To the Jewish people who are everywhere. His distribution list includes Klal Yisrael who live in the far-flung reaches of the empire, not the Jewish empire. And he writes them a letter and he says to them, we may have to delay Pesach this year, just FYI. Now, why should I care about that if the reality is that there's no temple left, there's no Korban Pesach left? But wait, the Rambam notes that when the Torah tells us in a very, very challenging sentence as part of the Tochacha, the rebuke that we find at the end of Parshat Bechukotai, at the end of Sefer Vayikra, V'natati dareichem chorba v'ashimoti et mikdasheichem v'loriach berech nichochem. I will lay your cities in ruin and make your sanctuaries desolate, and I will not savor your pleasing aromas. The fact that the Gemara said, the Torah, said, God says, I will destroy your sanctuaries, is understood to mean by Chazal already in the Gemara that even after it's been destroyed, the place remains sacred. Even years later, it retains its sanctity. Again, another off-ramp for another discussion. To what extent does it remain sacred? But the Rambam Maimonides paskins, as a matter of halacha, he writes on this basis, Lefichach makrivan korban kulon af pi she'ein sham bayit banui. We may offer offerings in the place of the mikdash, even without a mikdash. That's what he writes. And he says you could even eat from the korbanot in the whole area of the Azara, even though it's been destroyed in the whole courtyard of the temple itself. We can do this. He describes the whole idea that, in fact, the sanctity of Jerusalem did not evaporate when the destruction came of the second Beit HaMikdash. And he says, why do I say this? Why do I say this? And with regard to the sanctity of the rest of Eretz Yisrael, for the Shemitah that's coming up, for Shvit, for Masrot, for everything else, for other elements, I say it was not sanctified. For the rest of Eretz Yisrael, for other mitzvot, it's not sanctified. But I say Yerushalayim, that didn't move. Writes the Rambam, Lefish Kedushat HaMikdash Yerushalayim Pnei HaShchina. Ushchina Eina Betela. The sanctity of the temple, of its place, and of Yerushalayim, that's because of divine presence, and the divine presence is not canceled, as it says in the pasuk V'shimot Mikdashechem V'amru Chacham Alfi Shishomin Bikdushatan Hein Omdim. And basically, what you have here is the Rambam writing as a matter of halacha that even after there's no more temple structure standing, if you could get into Yerushalayim, if you could get to the Temple Mount, he paskins that you could still offer offerings. Writes the Netziva Volozhin in his commentary on the Torah and his Hemek Davar, in the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, until the time of the destruction of Beitar, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, till circa 135 of the Common Era, Sha'az Nachra Shahecha V'Nera Samizbeach, only then was the entirety of the sanctuary completely razed and was the altar destroyed. But until then, Haya Or Mizbeach Kayam V'Kruvru Alav Pesachim. From the year 70 of the Common Era through until circa 130 something, the Jewish people were still getting up to Yerushalayim, no Beit HaMikdash, but they're offering offerings. They're still doing the Korban Pesach. Who's sending letters to the diaspora? Rabban Gamliel. The Yavitz, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, his Sheila to Tshuvot, actually writes this as well as a possibility. He says maybe it's true. It's very likely, in fact, Ulai, he doesn't know 100%, he says, Ulai ayadayin mamizbeach kayam, v'ikriva korbanot tzibur, maybe even public communal offerings. Later on, he says, I'm not sure communal, maybe just the Paschal lamb, the Korban Pesach itself could keep going. Another option, we could also say that the reason why they were writing those letters, why is Rabban Gamliel writing that letter to Chutz La'aretz? He's writing it to all the far-flung reaches because they were convinced that it's just a few minutes until the Beit HaMikdash will be rebuilt. At all times, it could come back. They thought, any day now, any day, we're going to be rescued, and that's it. There'll be again a Beit HaMikdash. We will see the Beit HaMikdash rebuilt. It will be reestablished suddenly. Peta pitom, it's coming back. And therefore, we're telling everyone, each year we're sending a letter. My dear friends, writes Rabban Gamliel of Yavne, we have to be ready and willing and able to come immediately when the time comes. So I just want you to know, I'm intercalating the year. I just want you to realize that that's going to be happening. By the by, adds the Yavitz, Rabbi Yaakov ben Tzvi, also known as Rabbi Yaakov Emden. They still had the way of figuring the Kiddush HaChodesh, doing the months based on actually observing the moon. They weren't relegated to using a calendar. Still Al Pi Re'iyah. That's still going on, and they're getting ready maybe. He's not 100% sure, but he supposed it could be one or the other. In 2014, uncovered in Yerushalayim, and still on display somewhere there today, is a monument bearing the name of Hadrian, Sheikh Tamya. May his bones be ground up, as Chazal would write about him each time. It was found in Jerusalem. And this slab was dedicated to him for his visit to Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, in the year 130. And what does it say? I had to have it translated through the article, since I don't read I read the Latin Roman script, but I have no idea what it's talking about. You can read it for yourself. I don't want to read it out loud. I think it's giving him too much credit. He was a wicked, wicked man. And when he arrives in the land of Israel, and particularly when he makes his special pilgrimage to the holy city of Yerushalayim, what does he do? He has the city of Yerushalayim rebuilt, but under his name and on his terms. And in 130, he is the one who establishes Jerusalem and its surrounding environs as Eila Capitolina, now with under a Roman name, and now with a temple being dedicated, where exactly on the spot of the Beit HaMikdash, right there, he builds a temple, and of course, it's a temple not for God, but for idolatry. It's for Jupiter. Lo Aleinu. Chas milahazkir, the words of Avodah Zarah. And he makes two decrees. One decree is the following. The Jewish people will no longer enter Yerushalayim. Number one. Number two, the Jewish people will no longer engage in Brit Milah. Now, there are two positive mitzvahs that the lack of their fulfillment, according to the Torah, leads to being excised from the Jewish people. And they are Brit Milah and Korban Pesach. And so in the year 130, when he makes this visit, we have the date of when he started the reconstruction of the city, but not constructed in the way we would like, but constructed in a very foreign manner. And that is what it means when you look at the Mishnah in Masachet Ta'anit, that we have the destruction of Beitar and the plowing under of the city of Yerushalayim. Because there was the destruction of what transpired in Beitar. That was part of the Bar Kokhba revolt that was put down. The Bar Kokhba revolt from the years circa 132 of the Common Era until it was crushed, sadly, 2.5 to 3 years later, 135. And the net result after that was the plowing over of the city. This, according to the Netziv and possibly Rabbi Yaakov Emden, this is the destruction of the Mizbeach. This is the inability of the Jewish people to enter that place. And now we come to the Seder of Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon, all contemporaries, all people, at least most of these people, other than Rabbi Tarfon on this list, these are the people who went to Rome in 95, circa, and these are the people who are alive during the Hadrianic persecutions, some of them sadly killed during the time period of the Hadrianic persecutions. And here they are in Bnei Brak, and they're telling the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim the entire night. And it doesn't mention that they're offering a Korban Pesach for obvious reasons. They're in Bnei Brak. Well, why didn't they go to Yerushalayim? They couldn't go to Yerushalayim. Why are they having this Seder now? What are they discussing? I'll come back to it in a few minutes. But I want to focus again on Rabban Gamliel of Yavne for a few minutes together, because Rabban Gamliel of Yavne no doubt himself, living through this period, he was the Nasi, he was in charge. There was a moment where after a period of time, there's a controversy he has with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, not for now, where he's deposed and he's brought back in some capacity. Let's focus on him for a few minutes, Rabban Gamliel of Yavne, because the Gemara describes that Rabban Gamliel, this is actually, according to Rashi and others, this is Rabban Gamliel of Yavne. He had three things that he was more machmir about, like Beit Shammai, and he had three things that he was more makil about. The Mishnah Masechet Beitzah says that among the things that he thinks you could be more makil about, he says that actually on Pesach, you know what you should make for your meal? You should make a gedim mekulas. In English, it's called generally a helmeted kid. Now, why it's called a helmeted kid, there's a bit of a discussion back and forth why that is. Is it about the way in which it is going to be roasted on a spit with its entrails outside it or inside it? It's a bit of a technical discussion. The Chachamim didn't like this idea. He was outnumbered by the other sages. But at least at some point, he thinks, all right, we don't have a temple. We don't even have a mizbeach. Let everybody roast their own kid. He's trying to bridge the spiritual distance that's been imposed upon the Jewish people that now became a wider distance. Rashi here writes, Vayu osin zeich lamikdash, that davka, it's called mekulas, because of the way they would hang the various entrails and the innards of the animal outside, according to this Rashi at least, outside of the animal, but on the spit, where it was being roasted over an open fire. And they did this zeich lamikdash, because the Torah says it has to be al kra'av al kirbo. And mekulas means the language of a mighty person who is helmeted, that keeps their weaponry right next to them. They're wearing their armor. The Chachamim didn't like this idea. You know why? Because it was too close. They were worried that people were going to say it's now permissible to offer offerings outside of Yerushalayim and to eat sacred offerings outside of the confines of Yerushalayim. What we have here is that Rabban Gamliel of Yavne is actually trying to figure out, so what can we do? We don't have a Beit HaMikdash, and we don't have the main part that we need for the night of the Seder. So what can we put in its place? Let's put a lamb, or let's put a little kid, but it's got to be some animal that we can roast in the same manner, make it look the same, everything the same. The Chachamim said, Rabban Gamliel, we're not going to allow that, because it'll teach the wrong lesson. The Gemara goes on to describe that in Rome, Min Hastam, around, it's obviously the Second Temple period, about this Gedim Mekulas, we have the story of Rabbi Yossi, who was also a contemporary of all of these people. He said there was a man named Todos, Ish Romi, Theodosius. Talk about a Jewish name. It's a Yiddish nomen for a little boy. V'karei Shmo b'Yisrael, Todos. He lived in Rome. And what did he do? He told the people in Rome, the Jews of Rome, hey, Yidden, everyone should take a little lamb here in Rome and offer it as part of the night of the Pesach Seder. Because, my dear friends, we'll remember this way that we used to live in Yerushalayim. And what do they say to him? No. If you weren't Todos, it's a bit of a debate. What does that mean? Is it because he was politically powerful or because he had some kind of great spiritual leadership that he was engaged with? They said, if you hadn't been that person, they sent him a letter from Israel. You're giving the people, it looks like you're giving people, you are giving people sacred meat, korbanot, bachutz, outside of Yerushalayim. It's not allowed. The Gemara says, really? Literally? No. Ke'ein kochim. It looks that way. It doesn't look good. We just can't do that. The Mishnah later on, Masechet Pesachim, says that Rabbi Tzadok, Amar Rabbi Tzadok, who's Rabbi Tzadok? Remember him? The three requests of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Number one, give me Yavne or sages. Two, give me the line of Rabbi Gamliel. Number three, save Rabbi Tzadok. Rabbi Tzadok reports there was an event that happened with Rabbi Gamliel that he told his slave, his servant Tavi, go out and why don't you roast for us the Korban Pesach on a grill? The Gemara here describes this. Again, a bit of a discussion about what is this Gedim Mekulas, and maybe how could it be that he did this? It seems very strange. And the Gemara says, no, well, it's not exact. If the fact is that if you cut one limb off and you don't roast it, you do something to show that it's different. You boil a limb, you don't roast the whole thing. Then you show that it's not really Gedim Mekulas. The only one that you're not allowed to do is if you roast the whole thing exactly in the manner of the Korban Pesach. But if you do something that's like a shinoi, it would be okay. But we have here a testimony that Rabbi Tzadok is saying about Rabban Gamliel, that in fact, he was offering some kind, not offering an offering, but he was cooking a roasted meat for the light of the Seder. He was doing this practice. He was actually engaged in it. Now, there's a bit of a debate which Rabban Gamliel this is. It might be an earlier time frame. It might be the Rabban Gamliel Hazaken, the elder, the grandfather. But it begs the question, does Rabbi Tzadok knew the grandfather? Maybe, maybe not. We know for sure that Rabban Gamliel of Yavne had a slave named Tavi. There are several stories about Rabban Gamliel of Yavne extolling the virtues of Tavi. So you have certain people saying, no, this is really the elder, but he bequeathed the slave that he had, Rabban Gamliel the elder, to his grandson, as well as the slave was bequeathed also. To me, it's, I don't have a word for it. It's like, come on. Rabban Gamliel of Yavne was the one who had an Eved named Tavi. We have no record Rabban Gamliel Hazaken had an Eved of that way. What am I pointing out? There's another example where he told his fellow, go, I want you to do this. Even after the sages said, go do it. But he said on a grill. And the Gemara will say further along, no, the truth is, if you do it on a grill, it's not supposed to be kosher. The Gemara ends up saying, well, the truth is, if it's a grill that has slats, that is possibly kosher. So just giving you an example that he did this. It's really puzzling that even though the sages told him no, either was he defying them? It's not clear. So the Rashash, one of the commentaries in the back of the Gemara, it's a long piece, I don't have time to read it, but he basically says the following. Rabbi Gamliel knew that it's forbidden to roast the Paschal lamb, the Korban Pesach, on a grill. Davka, he said to Tavi, I want you to make the Paschal lamb, not really, but I want you to make a gedi, mikulas, or he called it Pesach. He didn't really mean the Korban Pesach. He just said, make it on a grill. So people will realize, Rabbi Gamliel knows the halach is very basic. You cannot make it really, really on a grill. Why did he call it Pesach? I'm scrolling up, don't get dizzy. It said, go roast for us the Pesach. Why did he call it a Pesach? So the Rashash says, you know why he called it a Pesach? Zeichel Pesach. He didn't literally mean it's the Korban Pesach. It's impossible. It's unfathomable. But he called it the Pesach to show that we have to do something at our Seder to say, we're missing the main thing, but we're going to bridge the spiritual distance. At least we'll have an object there, and we'll eat that object. It'll be this element. And they'll be involved in trying to be engaged in some way in the notion of Pesach, even though we don't have the Korban. Of course, we don't do that today. The Shulchan Aruch says when you go to the butcher shop, let's say, or you order something from wherever, from your favorite butcher shop, online or in person, you may not point to any of the meat and say, this meat is for Pesach. That's a halacha. You're not allowed to say this meat is designated for Pesach. Why? Because it looks like you're designating it while it's alive to be for the Korban Pesach. And then it's like you're eating kodshim, eating sacralized meat outside of your shalim. Rather, you should say this meat is for Yom Tov. It's for the holiday. But don't say it's for Pesach because we'll get confused. The Rama adds that the Gedima Kulas, this is not allowed to be done, whether or not you call it Pesach. You cannot make a Gedima Kulas. It's just not allowed. Just to realize what that means. So then the question came up: are you allowed to roast things at all and have roasted food at your Seder on Pesach night? Stands to reason. I mean, we have the zroa. That's another year. I talked about the zroa. It's sitting there. You're not allowed to eat it. You're not supposed to eat it, because it's in memory of the Pesach. What do we have here, though? The Mishnah Masechet Pesachim says, "Makom shenagu le'achol tzli b'leilei Pesachim ochlin." In some places, they do have a tradition to eat roasted meat on the night of Pesach, and then you can eat. But if you have a tradition not to, you're not allowed to eat. Why? Because it looks just like you're eating the Pesach outside of bachutz, means outside of Yerushalayim. So the Shulchan Aruch here paskins that it's a minhag Yisrael, either this way or that way. But whichever your minhag is, you have to follow that minhag. You cannot just change it up. This obtains not only when it comes to lamb or a kid, which are kosher to be used as Korban Pesach, when the Beit HaMikdash was rebuilt, even if it's made out of a calf, even if it's fowl, anything that requires shrita, you cannot have it roasted in a place where the minhag is not to eat roasted food. The Mishnah Berurah says in our lands, the minhag is not to eat anything roasted on the 2 nights of Pesach, and that includes pot roast. That includes something that was roasted in a pan. If it has a sauce, that's okay. But if you roasted it in the pan and at no point you didn't cook it, and the last thing that was done to it was the roasting, that cannot be done. So he writes here, but if it's no water, if there's no kind of sauce at all, that wouldn't be permissible. Even though it doesn't actually look like the roasting of the Pesach, because the Pesach that was actually cooked in a pot would not be kosher. Nonetheless, it's not allowed. Why? Because of mara to ayin. It doesn't look good. We can't do that. We're not going to permit it. And people will decide that you're allowed then roasted food altogether, and from there one thing will lead to the next. It's not allowed. Even if you started with cooking and then you roasted it in the pot, you can't do that. Same issue. He does add, if someone is sick, then there might be a reason to be mekel. If you roasted it and then you cooked it afterward, that is permitted according to all opinions. The appearance of what it might look like that we're sacrifices, we're making something that looks like a sacrifice outside. And of course, Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne, his idea did not hold sway in this period of time after there was no longer a Mizbeach, if we take what the Netziv and the Yavitz write at face value. And of course, now we come to what actually happens at our Seder. Rabbi Gamliel shows up at our Seder about 2/3 of the way in to the part of Mage. Rabbi Gamliel taught, if you didn't vocalize, if you didn't verbalize, say the words out loud on Pesach, then you're not mekayim the mitzvah of Pesach. What mitzvah is that? So probably the mitzvah of Sipur Yitzim. I'm telling the story. The first one is to mention the Pesach matzah umorah. Every year I have to hold myself back because I was saying Pesach al Shuma. I have to hold myself back. You're not supposed to point to anything and say Pesach zu. There's no Pesach. We don't have a korban Pesach. We just say Pesach. We get to the matzah. It's matzah zu, marozeh. But the Pesach, there's nothing to point to. There's a zroa. We don't even go that far. And here we have in the Mishnah, when Rabbi Gamliel said this in the Mishnah, he mentions the Pesach al shum shepasach hamakom abati b'teva Mitzrayim. Yet when we get to our Haggadah, what do we have in purple? Pesach shaya b'tenu ochlim bismash benukdash hayakayim. We changed the language. The Baal Haggadah had to modify the language of what's in the Mishnah, because in the Mishnah, it still sounds like you could be pointing to something. This is the same Rabbi Gamliel of Yavne. We're pointing maybe to the Pesach, matzah, maror. But in the Haggadah already, it's changed to what our forefathers ate when there was a Beit HaMikdash standing. For want of time, I won't read you the Rashbats, but he basically says this Mishnah was taught after the destruction, in his estimation. And therefore, these words were added. In the Rashbat's edition, Shimon ben Simach Duran, in his edition of the Gemara, of the Mishnah rather, it had these words already. We don't have that. We just have, in our version, the Ram Shas, the Vilna Shas just says, Pesach, on account that God passed over the houses of our forefathers in Egypt. Okay. And that's where we come now to Afikoman. Here now we come to the stand-in of some kind. We have a Mishnah, it's very brief. We should not have after the Pesach, after we eat the Pesach, meaning seemingly the Korban Pesach, we should not eat the any kind of Afikoman. Now, what is Afikoman? So let's start with this. Afikoman is not a Hebrew word. Afikoman is Greek. What does it mean? Depends who you ask. So Afikoman seems to mean something about the way in which in ancient Greece and then in Rome, at the end of the party, you got up and you went to somebody else's party. You went party hopping. You joined somebody else's Suda. You enjoyed the festivities with someone else, with your wine and your song. Ein maftirin achara Pesach, Afikoman. When we finish with the Pesach, there's no Afikoman. We don't go anywhere else. We stay home. Now, when you look actually at the Gemara here, you see already how this came about. We have Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Ein maftirin achar matzah Afikoman. That's a little slip. It's not the Pesach now, as it was in the days of the Mishnah. Now it's after the matzah. We don't do an Afikoman. You should be asking yourself right now, wait a minute, I thought the matzah I eat at the end of my Seder, at the end of the meal, is called the Afikoman. So let me give you a news flash. What are the two loaves of bread on your table on Friday night and Shabbos day called? They're called challah. But you know that it's not challah. Challah is that which you took away from this dough in order to be able to eat from it. Challah is what you removed. It's what you don't eat. Whey led on to whey, and people start calling it challah because it was already, as it were, after we've taken the challah. So when someone say, can you hand me the challahs? I forgot to take challah. Understand? Same thing. At some point, the word Afikoman went from after we eat the Pesach or after we eat the matzah, there's no Afikoman to, you see this? Oh, this thing is called the Afikoman. By the by, it should not be lost on us that the very word Afikoman is not in Hebrew. And the fact that it's not in Hebrew and it made it into our Seder, it should give us pause about what's going on. The Ein Maftir Nachar Pesach Afikoman. So there's a discussion, what does Afikoman mean in the Gemara itself? The Gemara debates whether it means something about going place to place. That's Rav's view. You shouldn't go from one Suda, from one Chabura to the next. Shmuel says it has to do with various kinds, and Rav Yochanan, various kinds of desserts that you would bring out after. Had they had Barton Seder mince, it would have been on the list. There's no Barton Seder mince when you finish eating your matzah, which today we call Afikoman, right? The Seder mince after would be called Afikoman. Eat the Seder mince before. The dessert needs to be, the last thing you eat is the Afikoman. No, I mean, it's the Pesach. No, I mean, it's the matzah. Now, if I invited you to my home for a beautiful barbecue, and you arrived at the barbecue, and I handed out buns that were beautifully toasted, and you took a bite with all your condiments, and you just, as the lady said in 1980s campaign, where's the beef? You invited me to, this is an insult. You invite me to your house, and this is what I get? You say, no, we're supposed to eat the meat, but we can't. So instead, you know what we do? We eat the bread that went with the meat. It's the best we can do. So that taste is, the taste itself is baleful. It's accentuating the sense of loss. It's the matzah eaten with the Korban Pesach. Rashi says that's what it means. Ein maftirin achar matzah afikoman. What does it mean after the matzah? We don't eat afikoman, means we don't eat a dessert. We have to eat the matzah at the end of the Seder to remind us of the matzah that we used to eat with the Pesach. And this is the matzah, the cut matzah, the one that was broken, that we eat actually at the end of the meal to accentuate this is actually our fulfillment of the mitzvah of eating matzah. According to this view, Rashi's view, you make a bracha al achilat matzah at the beginning of the Seudah, the Shulchan Orech, the first thing, a motzi matzah, you eat the matzah. According to Rashi's view, if you follow the logic, you have not completed the mitzvah, you have not even fully fulfilled the mitzvah until you've eaten the matzah at the end of the Seder, at the end of Shulchan Orech, which is the matzah that used to be eaten with the meat. We don't have the meat. Nebuch, what can we do? Based on this, we have a report from Rav Yosef Dov Levi Soloveitchik that his grandfather, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, would not speak the entire meal because he said he's in the middle of the bracha. He made a bracha al chilat matzah. He had his first piece of matzah because he has to eat the meal. But the real fulfillment of the mitzvah, according to Rashi, by the way, the Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, holds this way as well, is only when? At the end of the meal. It's the last thing you eat. And it's accentuating the loss because we don't actually eat a Korban Pesach. There's no Korban Pesach. Yeah. The second option is the Rosh. The Rosh said to Rashi and the Rashbam, I disagree with you. I don't understand what you're talking about. How could the matzah you're eating at the end of the meal be in remembrance of the matzah that was eaten with the Korban Pesach? If that's true, then the matzah at the end of the meal should have maror with it, should have charoset with it. And nobody holds that at the end of the meal you have to eat that because those condiments, maror, charoset, were actually part of the consumption of the Korban Pesach as well. But we don't do that. It says, after the last matzah, we don't have an afikoman. So, excuse me, how could you claim that it's still fulfilling the mitzvah of matzah? No, this is the Rosh. The mitzvah of matzah, you fulfilled already in the first kezayit, the first olive's worth that you eat at the beginning of the Seder. What's at the end of the Seder? Nearly to matzah, it's not really an obligation in the biblical sense, but rather it's rabbinic. It's in memory of the Korban Pesach, which was eaten at the end of the meal when you're already full. That was actually how you had to eat the Korban Pesach when it was offered, when it will be offered. And since it is a Zeichel Pesach, you have to give the halacha of Korban Pesach to it, which is just as we were not allowed to eat any desserts and not allowed to get up and go elsewhere after we ate from the Korban Pesach, so too we don't eat anything after we finish eating the matzah, which is the matzah of that we call today Afikoman. Now, the last two kosot, why are we allowed to drink those? Someone wrote in. It's a good question. I just saw that one right now. That's another discussion. The short answer is it's drinking and not eating, and it doesn't mitigate the taste of the matzah enough. And we want to make the whole frame. That's a topic having to do with the 4 cups. Your question is a good one. I hope that contents you at least for the brief period of time. I'm running short on time here, so let me telegraph. The Shulchan Aruch actually gives us a number of halachot about eating that last matzah at the end of the Seder, which, by the way, what does the Shulchan Aruch call that matzah we eat at the end of the Seder? It calls it the Afikoman, just like challah. Now it's called the Afikoman. You're not allowed to eat? No, that's what we call it now. That's colloquially, that's what people started to do. Just like Rabban Gamliel said to his servant, go roast me the Pesach. It wasn't really the Pesach, but he called it that, according to the Drasha at least. When you finish eating the meal, you have to make sure that there's matzah that was guarded under the tablecloth. Today we say the kids take it and they hide it, right? Which is its own Dvar Torah about what is the beauty of handing over to children a linchpin, not only the Seder, but of the remembrance of the Korban Pesach. A person's not allowed to have their mind stray from thinking about the Korban. It's actually halacha about Korbanot generally. You have to be focused, kind of what's called a Hesech Hadat. So you have to have it shmura tachra map. It's not tachra mat, it's in a little bag, it's wrapped up, it's something, if it's hidden some other location. You have to eat a kazai. Each person eats kazai just like the Korban Pesach. And it's actually, Shulchan tells us, just like it was eaten at the end of the meal. The Korban Pesach was eaten when you're already full from the rest of your meal, from eating other foods, the Korban Chagiga, etc. You have to lean just like the Korban Pesach. There's no bracha on it because you're not really eating the Korban Pesach. You have to be careful. You have to try to eat it before Chatzot, just like the Korban Pesach. That's the halacha. And says the Mishnah Brura, the best thing to do, if you can do it, is really to eat not one kazait, but 2 kazaitim. You know why? We're worried a little bit about what Rashi and the Rashbam said. So in other words, according to the Mishnah Brura, lechatchila, a person should take 2 kizaitim, 2 olives worth. When you're already on a full stomach, don't eat a lot in that meal. It's 2 pieces, not literally, but the size. One of it is, I'm eating the matzah that used to go with the Korban Pesach. Nebuch, I don't have it. And now, lahavdol, it's like you came to my house lahavdol fe'avdol for that barbecue, and I give you the toasted bun, and I put a piece of toast in the middle. What's that in the middle? Where's the beef? We don't have that. So as a replacement, we put a patty in here. It looks remarkably like the bun itself. We put it inside. So that's what we're doing. The Rosh Hashanah says, if you can do it, it should be two kizaitim at the end for that reason. It's a lot of matzah on the night of Pesach, and that's why. Don't eat afterward. Same thing, right? All of these elements are meant to mimic the ideas of the Korban Pesach. Says the Ramah, you're not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach in 2 places. The Mishnah Brura says not even 2 places in the same room. Don't get up and go to another room in the same house, let alone go to another house. It would not be different than if everybody fell asleep and you had a total Hesech Hadat. Now the problem with placeholders, as some of us on this call today are aware from our studies of Masechet Sukkah, is that sometimes we're trying so hard to put a placeholder in that the placeholder starts to overtake the fact that it is a placeholder. The Gemara here describes a period of time where people would take their lulav and they'd give their lulav at the end of Sukkot to the next generation. As parents would be giving it to their grandchildren. They'd be bequeathing it to them, which is very strange. And it's a part of a discussion, Masachet Sukkah. Rabbi Yehuda wants to prove from this that, you see, they must have been dried out and desiccated, and yet the grandparents and the parents didn't hesitate. They gave those dried out palm fronds, those lulavim, to their children. Nebuch, we don't have it, but it must be kosher. They said to him, excuse me, you want to tell us that a shad hadchak, you're going to learn a lesson from this? It's an emergency. In an emergency, we're willing to do things they're not normally willing to do. In an emergency, we're going to relax certain rules, but it's not because it's really the way it should be. Just think about us the last year. Think about last Pesach, where Mechirat Chametz and Tevilat Kalim, and the whole question that was even coming up about can we have a Seder on Zoom was all because we're in an emergency situation. It wasn't like this is how it's going to be. We're in some kind of exigency. And says the Gemara further along, Amar Mar, lo matzah etrog, you don't have an etrog, don't bring a pomegranate. Don't say it'll look nice to have a quince, a parish there instead. Don't do it. You know why? Don't say, and your argument will be a good one. You'll say, Ki tishkach Torat etrog. I don't want people to forget the notion that there needs to be an etrog. So I'm not going to take just a certain year, the lulav hadassim and arav, I couldn't get the etrogim, they didn't come in the shipment. I'll take another fruit. No. You know why? Zimnin de nafik churba mine. Because the atil misrach, people will learn the wrong thing. A destruction will come from that as well. It'll fix, and then people will say, an etrog, you want to use a lemon, you want to use another type of a fruit, it's fine. It doesn't really matter. Well, it does matter. And the Chachamim were trying to figure out, how do we make a placeholder that's not going to take over and become the mainstay of what we have or meant to have in our religious life. There was another approach. Tosfot and the Rambam had this basic approach, which is the reason why you're eating the matzah at the end is not truly zecher lePesach. It's not zecher lematzah hanechelet im Pesach, but rather it's that the last thing in your mouth should be the taste of a mitzvah that is biblical. When the mitzvah, the biblical mitzvah of Pesach was extant, it was certainly the highest, most important mitzvah. So in that instance, we would eat the Korban Pesach last, to have that as the taste. That's why the halacha is as it is. But when we don't have that, what can we do? Then we should at least have the taste of the main mitzvah we have left. We can't taste the taste of the Korban Pesach in the Afikoman. It's, come on. But at least we'll have the taste of matzah, because matzah, unlike maror, by the by, maror is fully dependent on the Korban Pesach to be a biblical mitzvah. So it's actually rabbinic today. But when it comes to the world of matzah, matzah remains an independent, freestanding mitzvah even today, and therefore v'tam basar haPesach o mahamatzah b'fiv shachilatan hi mitzvah should be the last thing. That should be the hefsek seudata. That's how you end your meal, in that state of recognition that I want to have the taste of mitzvahs left. Even I can't have the mitzvah that I want, I'll have a mitzvah. It's an also ran, but at least it's something. And now we come back to that Seder, Seder in the darkness on both senses of the term. I'm hardly the first one to point out that the notion of night not only is direct understanding as a time of day, but also in its historical understanding. It's actually what's going on in this story as well. They're telling this story, Kol Oto Halayla, all that night long. There's a debate, however, that was settled in exactly this interaction. You see, the Gemara describes that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva had a discussion. And the discussion was, what's the point at which there's a deadline for eating the Korban Pesach? That debate comes to us in the Gemara Masechet Brachot and Daf Tet. And they're going back and forth, and I'll give you the upshot of the discussion. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says the deadline is midnight, and therefore the mitzvot of the night end at midnight. Rabbi Akiva disagreed. He thought that actually there was no deadline in the middle of the night. The deadline goes till dawn. Now the people came to visit him. They were his guests in his town of Bnei Brak. And he see Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, at least this night, even though halachically he disagreed with his colleague, with Rabbi Akiva, they sat together. They told the story the whole night. For Rabbi Akiva, it's still the mitzvah of Siprit Sip Mitzrayim. For Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, I'm sitting with my colleagues and we're talking about Torah. And we're having this discussion. The Rambam, by the way, in the end, halachically, we say at least lechatchila, the Shulchan Aruch writes this, we should finish the Korban Pesach, which we don't have, but at least the matzah, which at least we do have, by Chatzot. This year, I think it's 12:55 a.m. We try lechatchila to finish by then. That's actually a psak of the Shulchan Aruch. The Rambam and Hilchot Chametz Matzah paskin actually like the Rambam. You can eat the matzah any time of night. It is totally not linked to the Korban Pesach, even if the Korban Pesach itself had as a deadline of Chatzot at the midpoint of the night. We don't have that today, so just eat the matzah the whole night, which is consonant with the Rambam's view. What's the debate about? So the conclusion is here, there's a discussion going on still, even though they didn't have the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, still the mitzvah of Siprit Siyat Mitzrayim, and that could go all night, and there'd be Mekayim biblical mitzvah all night long. The conclusion of the storytelling portion of the Seder of Mage ends with this charge. In each and every generation, a person is obligated to see themselves as if they themselves left Egypt. Asks the Rosh Yeshiva Shivat Har Etzion, Rav Yaakov Meidan, do you think this means that every year the goal is to dress up and pretend it's 3,300 years ago and just say, we left Egypt and that's the whole thing? He says, that's incorrect. That's only the first step. The point is we're meant to actually see ourselves, means our generation, as if it is the generation that left Egypt. That is, that we're engaged in a process of Yetziat Mitzrayim, that it's playing out in the challenges of the time in which we live, whenever we may be living, and to read the events of our time by the light of the events of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Just consider that this same paragraph, the purpose of it, is told to us at the end of the paragraph. L'man havi otanu latet lanu et haaretz asher nishba labotenu, in order to bring us, to give us the land that he promised to our forefathers. That is the purpose. That is the purpose of sitting at the Seder, is to overcome the spiritual distance. It's to know that Jewish people in Tunisia and India, Jewish people in Siberia and South Africa, Jewish people, whether they are found in Brooklyn or in Boise, Idaho, are making a Seder. And they're thinking, so can I bridge the distance a little bit? There were two decrees that Hadrian made in the year circa 130 when he came. 130, 131, the exact year. But one was against Brit Milah. The other one was to remake Yerushalayim into a temple for idolatry and to bar Jews from going inside. So 5 sages of the Chachamim are not sitting, I do not accept that they are sitting literally planning. I know the historians want to claim this. They're not planning the rebellion, but they are certainly engaged in the mitzvot of the night. And those mitzvot include bridging between leaving Mitzrayim and arriving in the land that Hashem promised us. Says Rav Meidan, you know what the argument is between Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva is? Is it midnight or is it dawn? You see, midnight, as the Gemara itself concludes, I go back there to show it to you. What's the argument really about? The argument is, what is Shat Chipazon? When is the moment of being rushed, of being pushed ahead? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says it's the Chipazon of Mitzrayim. The midnight point was the point when God acted and the Jews were told, do nothing but sit at home and do mitzvahs. Take no steps outside. I do everything for you, says Hashem. That's what this Leila Seder is about. Rabbi Akiva says, the Chipazon, you know why I can go the whole night? Because the Chipazon is the Chipazon of the Jewish people the next day, on the morrow, getting up and walking out of exile. Now it's true, the halacha when it comes to the Korban Pesach was being eaten at the time before Chatzot, when the actual moment of the 10th of the 10 plagues transpired. But at least after the time period when you can no longer get to Yerushalayim, then we'll go to Bnei Brak and we'll sit with you, Rabbi Akiva, and we'll ask you, so what's the Chipazon to Yisrael? What do we need for the next step? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, one of the students of Rabbi Akiva, said to him, Akiva, Rabbi, Hayadoresh Darach Kochav Mi'akov, he understood the words of the verse, a star has crossed over, has shot it forth from Jacob, that it referred to a certain individual named Bar Koziba, named Bar Kochva. Rabbi Akiva, when he would see Bar Kochva, would say, you are the Melech HaMashiach. You're going to be it. You're going to lead us to victory. Rabbi Yochanan ben Torta said to him, Akiva, there'll be grass growing out of your jowls, meaning you'll be already dead before Mashiach comes. Mashiach will not have arrived. The first step to bridging the spiritual distance is in the awareness of the spiritual distance, of recognizing how long the road is and feels. And if you look carefully at what those first people who ever were worried about a spiritual distance coming up between them and Hashem and the Korban Pesach, it was actually, it said, we may be either impure or we may be on a long road far away. Maybe we're in a generation where we're so far away. Maybe we're in a generation where a whole year will transpire, where hardly an individual will come from Eretz Yisrael to visit us in Chutz La'aretz, and hardly a soul will be able to go from Eretz of Galut up to Eretz Yisrael. And we'll be so busy tumbling in our own little Dalet Amot. What will we do with the limitations and the distancing of the social that we'll put to the wayside? What about the distance from Eretz Yisrael, from Medinat Yisrael? How heartened I am to see Jews from Eretz Yisrael in our shul this morning, benching Gomel. How honored we are to know how many of our children, how many of our siblings, how many of our cousins and brethren live in Medinat Yisrael, live there today, but how distant we feel from them. And the derech rechoka from the Korban Pesach is a derech rechoka, a spiritual distance that is bridged first in the awareness of what's going on when we don't have a Pesach. This was actually a problem in the Middle Ages. You know, the tractates of the Talmud include many different names. We have a name for the tractate of Shabbat. It's called Shabbat. We have a tractate for Sukkah. That's Sukkah. We have Rosh Hashanah and Yuma and Beitza. Comes the tractate of Pesach. What's it called? Tractate Pesachim. 2 Pesachs. Why? A little strange. So some say, among the commentators, that this is because the 10 chapters of tractate Pesach at one time became 2 tractates in the Middle Ages. Chapters 1, 2, and 3 about Bedikat Chametz, about Isser Chametz, and chapter 10, which is about the Leil HaSeder, was 1 tractate called Pesach Rishon. Everybody learned that. It was practical. And there was another tractate, chapters 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You know what was in those chapters? About how to offer the Korban Pesach. One of them was being learned. The other one is gathering dust on a shelf. It's technical. I don't know what it's talking about. It's not my world. It's not the world we live in. We're living here over here in France. We're living in Portugal. We don't know from this. What do I, a Jew who lives in Australia, have to do with this story? I don't know. Okay, now we have one Masachet again, and it's called Masachet Pesachim. And this Sunday, many thousands of Jews, will finish this tractate, which has been reunited again to be one tractate together, united. They'll be finishing on the Daf Hayomi, a page a day, uniting Jews all around the world. There were people who tried to bridge this gap over the years. Don't think nobody tried to get there. The Kaftor Vaferach is actually one of the late Rishonim. He was around, we think he died in 1358. In his Sefer Kaftor Vaferach, Rav Ashtori Haparchi writes that actually there was a certain rabbi, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, who decided, I'm going to Yerushalayim. Now, who is Rabbi Yechiel of Paris? Tell you in one sentence, he fought in the disputation against an apostate Jew named Nicholas Donin, which culminated in the Jews winning, and then the 24 cartloads of Talmud being burned in the square, in the market square, and actually near City Hall in Paris. He, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, one of the Balei Tosfot, decided, I'm going to Eretz Yisrael and I'm going to Yerushalayim. V'sheyakriv korbanot bizman hazeh. I'm going right now to offer korbanot. When I heard this, so goes the report, reported here from Kaftor Afer from the 1350s. He died in the 1350s, but he had this report from the records of the Balei Tosfot. The person who reported said, I was so baffled when I heard this. I wanted to ask him, wait a minute, but we're all Tameh. Where is there a list of Kohanim that goes all the way back to the Kohanim Miyuchasim? We can't just put up someone who calls himself a Kohen and say they could just offer offerings. I was so beside myself, I couldn't even ask. So the Kaftor of Aferach writes, the Shelet Yavitz, and others say what he was really driving at, he said when he's going to go to Yerushalayim to offer korbanot, he didn't mean all korbanot. He meant the one korban that maybe you could eke out for various technical reasons I won't go into now, even without there being tahara, even without a kohen miyuchas, maybe there's a way around it, and that's Korban Pesach. Rabbi Yechiel of Paris followed the 300 French rabbis who made Aliyah in and around the year 1211, who were living already in Eretz Yisrael. He arrived and he set up a yeshiva in Akko in the year 1260. It's called, and get this, what should the name be? Medrash Hagadol de Paris. You know what I'm talking about. Every pizza store in Chutz La'aretz, every city that has its kosher pizza store has a place called Tel Aviv and Jerusalem Pizza and Jerusalem 2. And you get to Israel, what's the pizza store called? Big Apple. Lahavdol Fe'avdalot. What's the yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael called? Where did you learn Eretz Yisrael? I learned by the Mir. You learned in the Mir? No. My wife's grandfather, Lori's grandfather, Rabbi Yaakov Ring, Zichron Livracha, he learned in the Mir. You didn't learn in the Mir. You learned in Yerushalayim, and yeshiva called Mir. No, I didn't learn in Yerushalayim in the Mir. I learned in Brisk. I learned it. You keep filling in the blanks. Oh, I'm a Belzer. You're not a Belzer. You're from Yerushalayim. Ich bin from Belz. You're not from Belz. You were born in Jerusalem. You understand how it works. And it was going back in the days of the Rishonim, same deal. You come to the place, but we're from there. Okay. In the 19th century, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer was actually writing Sfarim, an early Zionist writer. You think Herzl started modern Zionism? A great example of intellectual thievery because politics got in the way. Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher and before him, Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai, were already politically engaged in the 1830s with trying to go to governmental officials of the Ottoman Empire and to rich Jews who could help with their own version of Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael. Before there was a JNF, there was a JNF. They were the pioneers, my friends. They were raising money. And this actually is the letter, the actual letter Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher wrote to Baron Rothschild to ask him in 1836, so can we make a go of it? Can we create something in Eretz Yisrael that will actually be a yishuv and have some kind of political independence? And then he wrote a book. The book was called Drishat Zion. By the way, who is Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher? He's a Talmud Mufak of Rabbi Akiva Eger. He's a Talmud Mufak of Rabbi Yaakov Milisa. He's nobody's fool. He wrote this Sefer, Drishat Zion, and in it, he has a whole section about how he thinks it is permissible today to go offer offerings, Yerushalayim, the Korban Pesach, not the other offerings, but if we could go up to that place, and he's asking, in 1862, he publishes this book. In 1839, by the way, after Rothschild, he appealed to Moshe Montefiore, Sir Moses Montefiore, to ask him the same thing. Can we go up to Yerushalayim? Can you help us buy off the Ottoman Empire to get permission just to go up and do this mitzvah? Now, Rabbi Akiva Eger, his rabbi, wrote a response. Rabbi Yaakov Milisa wrote a response, the one more favorably inclined, the other very much opposed for halachic reasons, not Zionism reasons, halachic reasons. The Binyan Sin, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, 4 tshuvas at the beginning of the Binyan Sin are all about this, written by Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher. Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher in 1868 went to Napoleon III, and he actually asked him to help him to get to Yerushalayim in order to have a certain group that could start a little yeshuv in Eretz Yisrael. And he, Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher, was writing letters to Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Reines, the founder of Mizrahi, to encourage him in his work because he realized that he was never going to make it to Eretz Yisrael himself. In 1874, he died in Torun, Poland. Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai came before him. Now, the truth is, this is a very complex halachic discussion because, as Rabbi Rasher Weiss has shiurim about this and various other contemporary posts can write about it, there are many halachic challenges to actually going ahead with this idea today. Many. By my lights, it seems insurmountable until Mashiach will arrive, until the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt, it seems. We need to know where's the exact spot of the Mizbeach. What about the fact that we're ritually impure? Is that a factor or is it not a factor, and to what extent? We don't have Kohanim Miyuchasim, means in direct line. We have Kohanim, we assume they're Kohanim Mechuzakim, but they're not Miyuchasim. We don't have the Big Day Kahuna. We don't know what actually some aspects are besophic about it. Rav Usher Weiss in the Shir, and I must tell you, Rav Usher Weiss has helped and saved so many Jewish communities over the period of COVID with his halachic mastery, with his sensitivity. I've been on many calls with him. I'm so indebted to him. I consider myself a Talmud from afar. But in his shir about this, he quotes from his Rebbe, the Kloisenberger Rebbe, the Divrei Yatziv, who said he heard from the Divrei Chaim, Reb Chaim of Tzanz, who said the following: we could really solve all the halachic problems and challenges that are involved in Hakravat Korban Pesach. We could do it. But the fact is, said the Kloisenberger in the name of the Divrei Chaim, we didn't suffer for 2,000 years of exile in order to give korbanot under the license of the Ottoman Empire, and thanks to the generosity of Sir Moses Montefiore. My dear friends, that sentence is the exact debate within the Olam HaTorah, which began between Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Everything will happen deus from Hashem. Hashem will do everything. We will sit back, and the Beit HaMikdash will come dropping down from Shemayim. We need do nothing but eat our Afikoman. And Rabbi Akiva, who said, that's not how it works. It's the same debate between those who are today religious Zionists and those who are not yet religious Zionists, because they're waiting. First Mashiach will come, then it will happen. So here we are. We are waiting for our Pesach Sheni. Not in the sense of Pesach Sheni, the second Pesach in Iyar, but the Pesach Sheni Davka of the Masechet Psachim, to be able to go back to having a Korban Pesach. There were those who did overcome the distance. There is one example of people who did overcome the distance, and it's in the book of Ezra. The book of Ezra for 6 chapters is in Aramaic. And Rav Yoel Ben-Nun points out that it's in Aramaic for an important reason, because it's the language of exile. And here we learn about the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. We learn that it was built under the aegis, actually, of foreign rulers by the order of Cyrus and Darius and King Artashasta of Persia. The Jewish people did this, urged on by the nevuah of Haggai and Zechariah, the Nevi'im. The Nevi'ut of Haggai and Zechariah was being fulfilled by them. And if you read what they write, Haggai and Zechariah, you would say, really? But it didn't come from the sky made out of fire. The people had to build it, and they had to negotiate with some foreign ruler. And there's so many different elements. Then came the different Kohanim and Leviim. They gave korbanot for Chanukat Beit Elohadina. They gave offerings. They made a Hanukkah in the time of Ezra. This is in the Second Temple period when they rebuilt the second Beit HaMikdash. But then the book switches. It switches out of Aramaic and becomes Hebrew. And when does it become Hebrew? When the Jewish people make the Pesach. Where were most Jews? They were still in Bavel. What were the Jews in Israel now called? They came back. What were they called? They were called the Bnei Hagola, the exile, the people from the exile. They were the people from fill in the blank, from Mir and Belz and Satmar and all the different places, and Kloisenberg. You can keep filling in the blank. They were called the Bnei Hagola. They made the Pesach on the first month of the year, on the 14th day. And it describes here that they ate, the Jewish people ate, the Kohanim, Leviim, etc., and anybody who had separated themselves from the ritual impurity of the nations of the world that was interested in seeking out the God of Israel. They made this festival for 7 days with joy, b'simcha, kisimcham Hashem. God gave them joy. They saved Leiv Melech Ashur Aleim L'Chazek Yidayim B'Melech Beit HaElokim Elokei Yisrael. Here the commentators say the king of Assyria, because he was the first to exile any Jews, but the king of Persia called himself also king of Assyria because he conquered the territory. They found joy even though they did not yet have a Beit HaMikdash rebuilt. They had a sense that they could connect to this mitzvah of Korban Pesach. Indeed, they were able to bring the Korban Pesach in a world that was far from perfect. Sefer Ezra goes from Aramaic back to Lashon HaKodesh. We begin our Seder, ha-lachma anya diachal avatana, it's in the language of Aramaic, and then finally we point matzazu in the Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew. We call it and eat what we call today the Afikoman, a Greek word, but we know that when we look at the Seder of the Seder, the index at the table of contents, it's called safun, something hidden, something that remains hidden until we will reveal it at the time of the arrival of the Goel Tzedek, the time of the return to the Hakrava of the Korban Pesach in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. In the waning minutes of the Seder, as everyone is already getting drowsy, but is hopefully also exuberant at having completed the Chasal Seder Pesach, Ki Hilchato, Kasher Zachinu, L'Sader Oto, Ke Nizke La'asoto, as we arranged it tonight, may we be Zochim someday to enact it. Adir Hu, God is mighty, Yivna Beitu Bekarov, soon, God will rebuild his house. And we'll end, of course, with the dessert of all desserts, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim Habanuya. The end of our Seder is the declaration that next year we hope and pray that we will have an opportunity to celebrate in Yerushalayim that is rebuilt when we have overcome the spiritual distancing of the time in which we live. Wish everyone a Chag Kasher V'Sameach. Thank you for joining, and I look forward to seeing everyone soon enough, if not on Zoom, then at least, God willing, in person, and we'll be able to dance the great dance again. Chag Kasher V'Sameach.